At first, it was just books, notes, and rushed research. But then, without you realizing it, something changed. Your gazes began to meet for longer than necessary. The silences ceased to be empty and started to communicate things no one dared to verbalize. You tried to ignore it. You covered it up with quick smiles, diverted your eyes to the pages, pretended that everything was still about learning. But the truth was there, pulsing between the spaces of unspoken words. Hearts raced, hands hesitated before touching the paper, and somehow studying next to each other became the most anticipated moment of the day. It was just a library. It was just another day. But now you know, it was never just about the studies. At first, everything seemed simple, books, notes, pages full of information that needed to be absorbed. But then something changed. In the middle of some explanation, attention began to latch onto details that had nothing to do with the content. The way someone spoke, the glance that lingered a moment longer, the way time spent with someone else began to matter in a different way. Maybe it was subtle at first. Maybe it seemed like just a coincidence. But the truth is that the other person's presence began to become an impossible detail to ignore. With each meeting, it was no longer just about learning or reviewing. There was something growing there, silent but undeniable. The little gestures began to stand out, the way someone casually tucked their hair behind their ear, how fingers glided through pages with ease, the change in breathing when the topic demanded more concentration. Details that should never have mattered, but somehow began to signify so much. And then, the excuses started to prolong those moments together. Shall we review just one more chapter? Can you explain that part again? I don't think it was very clear. How about we continue this tomorrow? Neither of these questions was really about studying. What was being sought was companionship, extra time, the chance to stay a little longer. But as the days went by, everything became too obvious. The glances no longer darted away as quickly. The smiles were no longer disguised. The silence between the pages was no longer just comfortable. It carried a meaning that no one dared to verbalize. And then came the touch. Nothing planned. Perhaps a brush of the hand while reaching for the same book. A light touch of fingers too quick to be an accident, lingering just long enough to make the heart race. And in that instant, it became clear that there was something beyond words. It was inevitable to wonder if the other felt the same. And they did. It was in the eyes, in the hesitant way of looking away and then back again, as if there was something about to be said, but couldn't yet be spoken. The studying continued. The meeting still took place, but the truth was already clear. This was not just about learning, grades, or knowledge. Unbeknownst to them, a story began to unfold, not on the pages of the books, but in the moments shared, in the stolen seconds between explanations and smiles. Now, only the question remains, how long can this continue, in that space between the obvious and the unspoken? Because deep down it is already clear, it was never just about studying. The days went on the same, but nothing was as it had been before. Being there became a moment waited for, even if no one said it out loud. The time spent together always felt too short, and any excuse to prolong it became valid. It was no longer just about learning, reviewing, or discussing ideas. Now, with each turned page came a silent anticipation. Each exchange of glances carried a weight that hadn't existed before. With every new study session, something became increasingly clear. That space was no longer just a learning environment. It had transformed into a place where a quiet connection was growing, slow but strong, waiting for just the right moment to become impossible to hide. And slowly, small changes began to happen. Their bodies were no longer kept so distant, a slight lean towards each other, as if the space between them had shrunk without anyone noticing. The hands moving over the paper seemed to have a different awareness of the closeness, hesitating for just a second longer before pulling away. The smiles were no longer just polite. They now carried a meaning that went beyond the context. The silences had become different. Before, they were merely common pauses, moments of focus. Now they were filled with unspoken words, with thoughts kept hidden that only needed a signal to be set free. And then came the exchange of messages outside of their scheduled time. Today was productive, wasn't it? Did you notice that detail we discussed? I kept thinking about it afterwards. Do you want to review a bit more tomorrow? But it wasn't about productivity, nor about the content. It was about continuing that conversation, even if it was just for a moment longer, about extending what, seemingly, still needed to be said. And the persistent doubt began to arise. What would happen if someone took a step forward? Because it was already clear. There was no denying it anymore. The study had become just a pretext. The time spent together had become the real reason to keep coming back. But now what? How far could this go? The boundary between what was merely an academic partnership and what could be something much greater was dissolving. And what would come next? It was still possible to pretend that nothing was happening. It was possible to keep having meetings, studying, making excuses to spend time together. But how long would that make sense? Because deep down, the question remained the same. Would anyone have the courage to break this silence? Because the truth was already in plain sight. It always had been. It was never just about the studies. The meetings kept happening. Time passed and yet nothing was said. But everything was there, in the way words took so long to come out, how eyes searched for some silent confirmation, how the body hesitated before pulling away. With each new day, the tension grew. Small details that used to go unnoticed were now impossible to ignore. The slight nibbling of lips while thinking, the almost imperceptible sigh after a statement was made, the way fingers gripped the pen tighter than necessary, as if they were trying to hold on to something much bigger than just a simple object. And the thought kept coming back, insistent and repetitive. What if someone said something? What would happen if, in the middle of any explanation, someone simply stopped speaking and looked the other in the eye for too long? If, instead of averting their gaze, there was enough courage to sustain the intensity of the moment. But no one did that. Silence was still the rule, until one day, something changed. It was an ordinary night, nothing special. The meeting unfolded as it always did, with books open, notes scattered, and the feeling that the time was never enough. But this time, at the end, when everything seemed to lead to the usual, "see you tomorrow," a moment lingered longer than it should have. Their eyes met, and for some reason no one looked away. The air felt heavier, denser, charged with everything that had yet to be said. The heart raced, as if it knew that this moment could be a breaking point. And then, without thinking, without planning, the question came. Is all of this still about school? The phrase hung in the air like something forbidden, like a boundary that until that moment no one had dared to cross. A second of silence, then another, and then a smile. Small, hesitant, but filled with a truth that finally didn't need to be hidden anymore. Someone didn't have to say anything for the answer to be understood, because now it was clear. More than ever before. It was never just about school. The silence that followed that question was louder than any word spoken up to that point. The air was thick with expectation, breaths held, eyes that could no longer look away. No one needed to respond aloud. It was too evident to be ignored. But what now? Was this the moment that had always been lurking? That inevitable instant that loomed closer with every lingering glance, every touch that lasted longer than it should, every word that seemed to hold something beyond its meaning. And then came the first step. Nothing planned, nothing rehearsed, just an instinctive movement, a slight lean toward the other, as if any distance was unbearable in that moment. The open books on the table no longer made sense. The scribbled papers were no longer important. The room around them, once full of significance, became a mere backdrop for something much greater. There was hesitation, one last flicker of doubt, as if the mind still tried to fight against the inevitable, but the heart had already made its decision long before that moment. Fingers brushed the edge of the book, but this time it wasn't to turn a page. It was just a small, discreet gesture, a mark of silent courage, and it was enough. A sigh escaped, followed by a look that carried all the answers. And then, without the need for another word, it happened. The space between the two disappeared. The touch was light at first, as if there was a fear that all of this might just be a delusion, something too fragile to be real, but it wasn't. It never was. Reality was warm. It was intense. It was everything that had been contained for far too long. The study had long been forgotten, because it was never about that. The initial touch was hesitant, as though there was still one last invisible barrier between what was permitted and what had until then been nothing more than a stifled thought. But in that moment, everything became clear. No explanation was needed. No justification would make a difference. The body reacted before the mind because it was no longer possible to pretend. The subtle touch became firmer, fingers found skin, and for the first time, there was no withdrawal. There was no disguise, there was no excuse to escape. Breath hung in the air. The heart beat so strongly it seemed to fill the entire space around them. It was then that the line was crossed, and even without a word spoken, they both knew. There was no turning back. The initial hesitation dissipated in an instant. Everything that had been contained for so long was freed, filling every inch of the distance between them. The warm air between their breaths intertwined. Their eyes remained locked on each other, and finally, after so many meetings, so many pages turned, and so many hours spent side by side, what was inevitable happened. The first kiss. No rush, no exaggeration, just the confirmation of something that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to happen. And when their lips parted, when their eyes opened, there was no room for doubt. The study no longer belonged to that moment. The books, the notes, everything around them was merely a backdrop for what truly mattered now. The smile came first, filled with everything that didn't need to be said. The silence was no longer awkward, nor filled with uncertainties. Now it simply affirmed what they both already knew. It was never just about studying. The kiss ended, but the moment lingered, trapped between quickened breaths and gazes filled with everything that had previously been avoided. No one spoke immediately. Not because there was nothing to say, but because any word would seem trivial in light of what had just happened. What do you do after crossing such a boundary? Their hands were still close, their bodies leaning toward each other, as if the air around them had changed in density. There was a silent anticipation, a restrained desire to stay there, to prolong that moment for as long as possible. Then came the first smile, subtle, almost shy, but impossible to contain. And it was that smile that dissolved the tension, that disarmed any lingering doubts. There were no more uncertainties. There was no longer a need to pretend that nothing was happening. But what now? The books were still open, the notes still scattered everywhere. The pretense of studying still existed, but it meant nothing anymore. None of the formulas, dates, or concepts written there seemed as relevant as what had just transpired. And then a new question arose. And now? The voice came out soft, almost hesitant, as if it were waiting for an answer that wasn't just, "Let's get back to studying." Going back was no longer an option, but there was no immediate response. Instead, a new look, deeper, more assured, because there was no uncertainty, because they both knew. The studying had been left behind long before that kiss happened. Now, everything was different, and no one wanted to pretend otherwise. The silence that followed that question was not uncomfortable. On the contrary, it was filled with an understanding that rendered immediate answers unnecessary. The air was still charged with what could no longer be undone, and no one seemed ready to be the first to break that moment. But there was one detail. The world around them hadn't stopped. The books were still there, the notes scattered about. Time moved forward, indifferent to the internal revolution taking place between the two of them. And it was in that moment that the next step came. Nothing grand, nothing exaggerated, just a simple gesture. A light touch on the wrist, fingers gliding across the skin with the same delicacy as someone leafing through an ancient and precious book. And in that touch, there was everything. The confirmation that what had happened was not a mistake, the certainty that neither wanted to turn back, the feeling that no matter how unexpected it was, nothing felt more right than being there together. Still, doubt lingered, not about what they felt, but about what would come next. The studies were no longer part of the equation, but what would happen from here? Are we going to keep pretending nothing happened? The question came low, almost a whisper. The others shook their head, laughing softly, as if the idea were absurd. Can you do it? The answer was in their eyes, in the way the smile effortlessly widened. Because no, there was no going back to how it was before. Pretending had never been a real option. So what to do? Move forward. Without haste, without immediate labels, but without any more excuses. The night wasn't over yet. Their time together hadn't reached its end, and this time no one wanted it to. It was never just about the studies, and now, comment, "I knew it," and subscribe for more stories.